Something quiet stirs, long before anything exists to hear it. Not a sound, not a pulse, but a tension so delicate it feels like the breath before breathing. In the deep canvas of nothingness, where no star has burned and no particle has yet taken shape, a trembling begins. It is faint, almost shy, like a ripple moving across a surface that has not learned what motion means. But the ripple persists. It grows not in size, but in intention, as if the fabric of reality is remembering something it has never known, yet somehow cannot forget. In this early dark, where even darkness has no meaning, the first imbalance forms. The stillness does not remain still. It bends ever so slightly, as though a weight has been placed on a weightless sheet, a curiosity pressing into a place that had no direction before the pressure arrived. Space, if it can be called that yet, twitches. A small difference blossoms where nothing had distinguished itself. A region where the quiet folds, another where it stretches thin. These contrasts begin to drift toward one another, attracted not by force but by the simple truth that difference seeks expression. And so the first tremor awakens. It does not roar, it does not shine, it does not announce itself with fire or fury. Instead, it slips into existence like the soft intake of a dreamer's breath. A curvature forms, subtle but certain, reshaping the smoothness around it. It is the beginning of contour, of direction, of possibility. For the first time in an eternity without measure, the blank expanse begins to make choices. What rises next is not matter, not energy, but potential. Tiny fluctuations flicker in and out, momentary sparks of what could be, whispering into the void. They vanish almost instantly. Yet the void remembers the places where they appeared. Each disappearance leaves a trace, a faint suggestion that something passed through. These suggestions accumulate, overlapping into patterns, and the patterns begin to lean, to sway, to move. Reality is learning the idea of motion. In the soft cradle of this pre-creation murmur, the first true asymmetry takes hold. One point surges a breath longer than another. One region curves with slightly more eagerness. These slivers of difference weave together until the stillness can no longer maintain its illusion. The tension becomes real. The tremor becomes inevitable. A moment comes small, trembling, and immense, where the quiet breaks. Not into noise, but into becoming. The landscape that was once perfectly even now folds inward and spills outward at the same time. The first directions are drawn. The first boundaries blur. A new kind of motion rises, one that does not flicker or fade, but carries itself forward, swelling from a whisper into a long, low exhale. Space begins to stretch, and in its stretching, it learns that it can expand. The tremor becomes a wave, sweeping through the emptiness, leaving behind trails of imbalance that will one day become stars, galaxies, and the paths along which time itself will walk. You drift within this awakening, weightless, and witness to a birth that feels both ancient and newborn. There is no light yet, but there is shape. No sound, but there is rhythm. The calm that once enveloped everything is now threaded with intention. A universe is not here yet, but the idea of one is beginning to hum. And as you float in that almost world, that soft, forming breath between nothing and everything, you sense a question rising from the tremor itself. A quiet wondering, as if creation is asking its own beginning. If this first motion came from stillness, will all motion one day return there? The question lingers, suspended in the growing curve of space, and you feel yourself pulled gently forward, carried by a wave that has only just learned how to move. And that is where your next journey leads, into the place where expansion begins to find its voice. The wave that carried you from the first tremor moves on, soft but insistent, widening the emptiness around you. What was once a smooth, endless calm now begins to show subtle contours, as though the fabric beneath your drifting form is learning to curve under its own weight. It is not a sudden shift. It is the kind of change that happens so slowly you only notice it when you look back and realize the stillness has already transformed into shape. Around you, the nothingness thickens. Not with matter, not yet, but with tendency. Space, for the first time, hesitates between stretching outward and turning inward, caught in a quiet argument with itself. One region dips, another rises, and the smooth sheet that once knew nothing of variance begins to sag as if cradling something fragile. You sense the tension deepening, the way cloth folds when two invisible hands pull in opposite directions. These curves are gentle at first, barely more than suggestions, but they grow, refining themselves through the same instinct that once guided the first tremor. The early fluctuations that winked in and out now leave deeper impressions. Space remembers where each one appeared, and those memories pull at the fabric, reshaping the emptiness with an almost maternal patience. The curvatures become more defined, like the outline of a thought forming before the mind has words for it. You drift closer and feel the way the contours guide your motion. There is a pull now, not forceful, not commanding, but persuasive. You are drawn not toward a place, but toward an intention in the fabric. Space is learning how to hold a direction. It is learning how to say here and there, where such distinctions once had no meaning. It bends not because something sits within it, but because bending has become its way of testing possibility. As the curves deepen, the wave that brought you from the first trembling spreads wider, stretching the contours into valleys and swells. The emptiness begins to organize itself, tracing gentle lines that arc across the horizon. These lines are not boundaries. They are invitations, soft hints that where space bends, motion will follow. Gravity has not yet been born, but the cradle for it is forming, a geometry waiting for a weight that has not yet arrived. For a moment, you drift through a region where the fabric folds downward like a slow waterfall. The descent is serene. You are not falling, not truly. The space beneath you is simply reshaping itself into something that resembles descent. You feel as though you are being lowered by hands made of silence, hands that do not touch, yet somehow guide. Elsewhere, the curvature flips, pushing upward in a gentle swell that lifts you like a tide rising under moonlight that has not yet been created. Up and down are beginning to emerge, not as absolutes, but as preferences. Space is practicing the art of direction, rehearsing the roles it will one day play effortlessly. You sense a new vibration humming through the folds, a deeper, slower resonance that feels like the whisper of mass long before mass exists. Something in the fabric is preparing. The curves are growing confident, rehearsing the embrace they will soon offer to the first particles. Open, soften, deepen, they seem to say. Become a place where weight can rest. Become a shape that can hold worlds. The quiet thickens again. You drift above a sweep of space that bends so gently it looks like the surface of a sleeping sea. The curvature is smooth, continuous, peaceful. It feels less like distortion and more like belonging, as though the void has stopped resisting shape and begun welcoming it. Then the fabric quivers, just once, almost imperceptibly. A deeper fold forms far ahead, too soft to be called a well, too subtle for the word gravity, but the intention is unmistakable. The idea of attraction, of motion, caused not by trembling, but by the shape of the path, has just entered the universe. You feel the pull again, faint but true, guiding you toward a place where space is beginning to teach itself a new rule. The curve ahead deepens, and you follow its quiet invitation. And that is where your next journey begins. With the moment curvature prepares to cradle the first sparks of light, the curve ahead deepens, and for a moment, the silence feels heavier, as if the newborn geometry is gathering itself for something it has never attempted before. The fabric trembles, not with fear, not with strain, but with anticipation. The contours that once drifted lazily now tighten, drawing inward as though preparing to hold a pulse. And then, within that shaped quiet, a glimmer appears. It is not brightness, not yet. It is too small, too tentative to be called light. More like a hesitation in the darkness, a place where the void pauses long enough for a possibility to remain instead of vanishing. You drift closer, and the glimmer grows, not in size, but in persistence. It refuses to fade. The fabric bends a little deeper around it, as though offering shelter to a fragile thought. Then the glimmer flickers. Once, twice, a rhythm forms, a trembling that no longer collapses into nothing. The fluctuation does not vanish the way its ancestors did. It holds. It endures. And because it endures, the fabric around it must respond. The curvature tightens, pulling inward like a hand closing around a spark it does not wish to lose. Energy gathers, space contracts, and the hesitation becomes a pulse. A moment later, the pulse becomes motion, not the wandering motion of the early tremors, but a directed one, a motion that leaps rather than sways. For the first time, something moves with intention through the emptiness. The spark slips from the curve that cradled it and glides along the fabric, following the lines that space itself has drawn. It does not fade. It does not fall. It travels, racing along the contours with a certainty nothing else in existence has yet imagined. This is the moment light learns what it means to travel. You follow its path, drifting behind its newborn trail. The spark stretches the darkness as it moves, leaving faint ripples in its wake, waves that hum with the memory of the curve that first released it. Those ripples carry information, tiny imprints of the geometry they pass through. The universe is beginning to store its own history, carried by a messenger that cannot slow down. The pulse quickens. Wherever it moves, the fabric bends, adjusting to its presence. What began as a single glimmer becomes a stream, a continuous unfolding of light where once there was only possibility. The stream widens, branching into waves that intersect and merge, weaving through the dark like threads of a tapestry that is stitching itself together. You drift beside one of these early rays and feel the way it reshapes the emptiness. Its passage defines a direction more precise than the curves alone could offer. Here, for the first time, straight exists not as a rigid path, but as the simplest way for a newborn photon to honor the shape of spacetime. Straight is not a rule. It is a preference whispered by the universe's geometry. Yet even now, the light cannot escape the influence of the curves. As it moves through regions where the fabric dips, the ray bends, drawn along arcs it did not choose. Where space tightens, the ray compresses. Where space stretches, the ray softens, its color fading into gentler tones. Light is becoming the storyteller of curvature, carrying the record of every shape it encounters. More sparks appear, rising from tremors so dense they ignite instead of dissolving. Light spreads across the forming landscape, tracing paths that resemble rivers running through a land that has only just learned what topography is. You feel the warmth of these newborn currents, not heat, but intent, like the quiet resolve of something that has finally found its purpose. The darkness is no longer uniform. It is veined with radiant pathways, delicate and steady, illuminating the folds of space that once hid their shape. Light is revealing the universe to itself, giving the cosmos its first glimpse of its own form. As you watch the rays drift through the bending fabric, you sense that something monumental has changed. Movement is no longer confined to trembling or drifting. It now has a speed, a constancy, a discipline. Light does not meander. It does not pause. It commits to its path with unwavering fidelity. And yet, you notice something else. Even as the light races forward, there are places it hesitates. Curvatures deep enough to tug at its course, regions where the fabric has sagged so far that the rays swirl instead of flying free. These pockets are not traps. There is nothing yet powerful enough to imprison light, but they are the seeds of gravity's future voice. You drift deeper into one of these forming wells, carried by the faint glow of the rays that spiral. gently toward its center. The curves cradle the light, shaping it into arcs and rings, teaching it the dance it will one day perform around stars and worlds. And that is where your next journey begins, with the first places where light discovers it cannot always choose its path, and the universe prepares to learn the meaning of falling. The spiraling rays fade behind you as you drift toward a region where the curves grow tighter, drawing the darkness inward as if cupping something unseen. The fabric here feels different, denser, more deliberate. It no longer bends merely in response to motion. It seems to anticipate it, shaping itself before anything passes through, as though practicing the art of containment long before it knows what it will need to hold. The early light that wanders into this region slows in its own way, not by losing speed, but by losing certainty. The rays hesitate, their straight paths softening into graceful arcs that swirl through the dimness. The spirals are not forced, they are invitations, the soft curves of a cradle waiting for its occupant. Space is beginning to understand that it can gather, that it can fold in such a way that motion no longer simply passes through, but is gently guided into place. These early folds have no mass at their center. They are pure geometry, hollow and delicate, like bowls carved out of silence. But the fabric trembles with the sense that something is coming, something that will require a place to rest, a place to collapse, a place to ignite. And so the folds deepen. They stretch downward, pulling the emptiness into a shape that resembles gravity before gravity exists. You drift along one of these forming hollows, feeling the way the fabric curves beneath you. The descent is smooth, a slow sinking that feels less like falling and more like settling into a soft bed. The closer you drift to the center of the fold, the more the fabric thickens, as if gathering its strength. It is preparing, not for a spark of light this time, but for something heavier, something that will press into the curve instead of merely gliding through it. Above the forming hollow, the rays of light circle in wide, patient arcs. They trace invisible lines across the darkness, their paths tightening with each lap, creating a faint glow that outlines the curvature beneath. Where light swirls, memory forms. The cosmos is teaching itself how to remember shape, how to imprint motion onto the fabric so the curve remains even after the rays drift away. For a long moment, nothing new arrives. The hollow waits, perfectly shaped, yet perfectly empty. But then, from far beyond the gentle horizon of the forming universe, a cluster of fluctuations condenses. Tiny tremors gather into a knot, dense enough to resist unraveling. They shimmer like the faintest embers of a fire that has not yet learned to burn. The knot tightens, compresses, and begins to drift toward the deepest part of the fold. Space responds before the knot even reaches it. The curvature deepens, welcoming the descent. You feel the fabric flex inward, a slow, patient exhale as the knot sinks into its waiting cradle. When it arrives, the fabric shivers not with strain, but with recognition. For the first time, space is holding something. The knot settles into the hollow, compressing the fabric further, reshaping it into a sharper, more defined well. Light that passes nearby no longer circles lazily. It bends with urgency, drawn toward the center where the knot rests. The geometry has become a force now, subtle but undeniable. Falling has gained meaning. Direction has found purpose. The knot pulses lightly, releasing faint ripples into the fabric, a soft heartbeat of forming matter. These pulses travel outward, trembling across the curvature, each one strengthening the well and teaching the surrounding space how to maintain its shape. The more the knot presses, the more the fabric learns. Gravity has not yet taken form, but the idea of it is already alive, shaped by these early interactions. You drift closer and feel the quiet power of the cradle beneath you. The fold is no longer an empty dip, it is a promise, a place where collapse and creation will someday intertwine. The knot glows faintly, not with light but with pressure, with the weight of potential gathering itself for its next transformation. Around the fold, the early universe begins to organize. Streams of light arc more sharply. Fluctuations drift toward the growing well. The quiet chaos of expansion is slowing here. Learning the discipline of attraction, the cosmos is beginning to understand structure, beginning to learn that it can gather itself into islands of coherence within an endless sea of motion. You float above the forming well and sense a deeper truth rising from its shape. This cradle is only the first. Countless more will follow, some small and fleeting, others enormous and eternal. Each one will hold a spark, a pressure, a collapse that shapes the stars to come. The universe is learning not just how to move, but how to anchor its motion, how to create places where change can rest long enough to become something new. And that is where your next journey leads, into the moment when the first true collapse begins, and the universe discovers the cost and beauty of holding too tightly. The cradle settles into its new shape, holding the gathered knot of trembling energy with a patience that feels older than time itself. For a long while, nothing changes. The knot rests quietly, dense but silent, like a secret waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The fabric around it curves protectively, soft as a cupped hand, shaping itself to every subtle pulse that rises from the knot's core. But inside that tiny heart of compressed possibility, a different story is unfolding. One the surrounding space cannot yet see. The knot is no longer content to simply sit within the hollow. Its own internal pressures, once random and fleeting, begin to align. Movements that once scattered now converge. Fluctuations that once pulsed outward now fold inward, pressed tighter by the weight of the forming well. The knot begins to heat. Not with fire, because fire does not yet exist, but with the frictionless intensity of compression. Motion that could not escape becomes motion bound inward, cycling through itself, spiraling into tighter and tighter loops. The once fragile shimmer hardens into something more deliberate, more determined. The knot breathes inward, drawing the curvature closer around it, deepening its connection to the space that holds it. You drift nearer, and the pressure radiating from the knot touches you like a faint vibration, steady and rising. It pulses through the fabric, reshaping the hollow into a perfect sphere. Light that wanders too close begins to whirl faster, its path tightening like a thread pulled into a vortex. The cradle is no longer passive. It is responding to the knot, learning how to compress not just space, but destiny. As the knot tightens, the surrounding fabric grows tense. Curvature becomes contour. Contour becomes weight. Weight becomes inevitability. The knot trembles with a swelling intensity, and beneath its surface, a threshold is forming, a point beyond which motion can no longer be contained. The moment arrives quietly. A single pulse escapes the knot, sharper than any that came before. It ripples through the hollow, bending space more deeply than the fabric intended. The knot contracts one last time, then releases all at once. A burst ignites at the center, a bloom of energy so sudden, so fierce, that the surrounding folds recoil, not outward into destruction, but into transformation. The collapse has learned how to burn. The hollow glows from within, illuminated by a brilliance that is not light, but the precursor to light, the newborn fury of compression becoming fire. Heat radiates out in waves that reshape the cradle, smoothing its edges, sharpening its depth. The knot has become something new, something stable and unstable at once, a core of relentless fusion that feeds on its own collapse. Space itself responds with awe. The surrounding fabric draws tighter, holding the blaze like hands cupping a flame against the wind. For the first time, the universe feels the presence of a center that is not merely heavy, but alive with process. The glow rises, softening the darkness around it, turning the once empty hollow into a chamber of unfolding radiance. This is not yet a star, but it is the promise of one. You watch as the burning core stabilizes, its pulses smoothing into rhythm. The cradle deepens further, forming a well strong enough to trap wandering fluctuations that drift too close. Each captured tremor becomes part of the fire, feeding the core, strengthening its hold on the space that contains it. Around the growing flame, the early universe reorganizes itself. Streams of light curve into tighter spirals. Particles drawn by the well's gravity now real, no longer a simple bending of space, begin to drift inward, gathering like dust around a candle. The hollow has become a furnace, and everything nearby feels its pull. You drift above this forming inferno and sense that the universe has just crossed a threshold. Collapse is no longer merely the act of falling, it is the act of becoming. Pressure is no longer the end of motion, it is the birthplace of fire. And yet, even as the core grows brighter, a quiet truth lingers beneath the glow. Burning is a fragile balance. Too much collapse, and the flame will devour itself. Too little, and the cradle will empty. The young universe is learning this balance, one fold at a time. You rise gently from the hollow, feeling the warmth fade as you drift back into the cool darkness between forming structures. The glow of the young fire dims behind you, though it continues to pulse like a heartbeat in the distance. And that is where your next journey leads, to the places where fires like this begin to gather others, shaping the first constellations in a sky that does not yet know it is a sky. The glow behind you softens as you drift outward, its warmth fading into the expanding coolness of the early universe. Yet, even from a distance, you can still sense the rhythm of the new fire pulsing through the fabric. It is no longer just a knot of compressed potential. It has become a beacon, a quiet insistence that motion and collapse can coexist, that fire can rise from pressure, and that light will eventually learn to shine. But it is not alone. Far across the forming landscape, in regions where the trembling contours have deepened in their own ways, other hollows have begun to cradle their own knots. Some glow faintly, still gathering the courage to ignite. Others pulse erratically, unable to find the balance between collapse and release. And a few, very few, have already crossed the same threshold as the first, bursting into the burn that transforms collapse into brilliance. Their light is still dim, more suggestion than presence, but you can feel their signatures in the fabric. Each one tugs at the surrounding space with a slightly different rhythm. Their hollows vary in depth and patience, shaped by the timing of their fluctuations and the quiet histories of the tremors that form them. You drift toward one of these distant wells, gliding through a region where the fabric thickens like slow-moving water. The glow here is younger, uneven, flickering, as though the forming core cannot decide whether it wishes to burn or sleep. It pulses once, twice, then dims before gathering itself again. The space around it trembles in sympathetic response, as if trying to reassure the flame that it does not need to blaze all at once. Closer now, you feel the heat of intention rather than fire. The sense that the core is learning, moment by moment, how to sustain its collapse without succumbing to it. A swirl of nearby fluctuations drifts inward, captured by the hollow's growing gravity. They spiral like leaves drawn into a whirlpool that has only just discovered its pull. Each captured tremor adds to the pressure, strengthening the flame, steadying its rhythm. You watch as the glow stabilizes, a soft ember settling into its own pulse. This furnace is smaller than the first, quieter, but no less determined. It is one of many, scattered across the growing cosmos, like lights buried beneath a dark ocean. As you move farther outward, the landscape becomes a vast field of cradles, some empty, some trembling, some blooming with newborn burn. The fabric between them is stretched thin, a delicate web of curvature connecting each cradle to the next. These connections are faint now, but they will one day become the filaments of the cosmic web, the great scaffolding upon which galaxies will rest. For now, though, the universe knows only beginnings. The fires do not yet know of each other. They are too young, too fragile, to sense anything beyond their own wells. But the fabric around them remembers. Every pulse radiates outward, faint ripples weaving through the dark, sharpening the lines of curvature that link distant hollows together. With each ripple, the universe becomes a little more structured, a little more aware that its fires are not isolated events, but notes in a growing harmony. You drift through this forming symphony, feeling the soft gravity of dozens of early wells tugging at you in gentle waves. Their pulls overlap, blend, and fade, creating a quiet rhythm across the expanse, a rhythm the universe has never heard before, a whisper of what will one day become constellations. As you glide across the dark between distant cradles, you sense something new emerging. The fires do not simply burn, they attract. Their wells deepen not just because of the light within them, but because they are beginning to feel the presence of one another. The fabric between them tightens ever so slightly, drawing them closer in ways no single flame could achieve alone. Some of these cradles drift toward one another, carried by the curvature they collectively create. Their motions are slow, patient, measured across spans of time so vast that even the young universe cannot yet name them. But the motion is real. The hollows are migrating through the dark, guided by the faint tug of their shared gravity. They are gathering, not yet into clusters, not yet into galaxies, but into the early dance that will one day give rise to both. A dance of attraction, pressure, collapse, and flame. A dance that is only just beginning to discover its own steps. You float among the young fires, listening to their distant pulses, each one a promise of light to come. And you sense that the universe is preparing for a new phase, not one of isolated cradles, but of union, where gathering becomes creation and proximity becomes structure. And that is where your next journey leads, into the moment when these first scattered flames learn how to move together, shaping the earliest patterns of a sky not yet born. The young fires drift through the darkness with patient grace, each one carrying the quiet weight of its own collapse. Their pulses echo across the forming fabric, overlapping in soft waves that ripple through the emptiness. These waves, faint as they are, begin to stitch patterns into the dark lines of subtle attraction that draw the cradles toward one another in slow, deliberate arcs. You drift alongside one such cradle as it moves, drawn not by intention but by the gentle tightening of curvature between itself and a distant companion. The space around them stretches like a web being pulled taut, creating a path that neither fire can see, yet both instinctively follow. Their motion is not hurried, it is the quiet drift of objects, learning that space can guide them. That direction is not only something they impose, but something they can be given. As the cradles drift closer, the fabric becomes more structured. The hollows deepen slightly, influenced by one another's growing gravity. Light passing between them bends a little more than before, tracing a shallow valley in space-time that will one day become the boundary of a star system. But that is still far ahead. For now, the gathering is gentle, like snowflakes drawn together by the faintest breeze. You rise higher, drifting above a region where several cradles move in slow procession. Their glowing cores pulse at different rhythms, some steady, some jittering with youthful instability. They pull at one another, tugging the space between them into a shared curve. Not enough to collapse together, not yet, but enough to create regions of denser geometry. These regions are the earliest seeds of the structures that will one day hold stars, planets, and the countless forms of matter not yet imagined. Between the drifting hollows, the fabric ripples with new possibilities. Tiny particles, still rare, still fragile, begin to wander into these deepening contours. They follow the quiet slope of gravity, swirling in faint spirals as they descend toward the young fires. Most arrive too quickly to settle, slingshotting around the glowing cores and flinging back into the dark. But a few slow down just enough to remain, caught in orbits that tighten each time they pass through the curved paths carved by light and gravity. These early orbits are messy and uncertain. Particles collide, merge, scatter, and fall apart again. Some lose themselves in the burning cores, dissolving into the fire that sustains each growing star. Others drift outward in wide loops, becoming the first loose debris circling a point that has not yet decided what it will become. You move among these wandering particles, watching how their motions shape one another. A pair of them crosses paths, grazing each other softly enough to remain intact, but firmly enough to change direction. Their new paths intersect with others, and soon a small cloud of matter forms a loose congregation, drifting through the early sky. The cloud's shape changes with every encounter, guided not by will but by the steady pull of the glowing cradle at its center. More clouds form around other fires, each one tracing the early outline of a structure that will one day become a solar system. The universe is not yet ready to give them that name. It is still learning how to gather, still learning how to hold separate motions in harmony. You drift closer to one forming cluster, where a large, dim cradle pulls a cloud of particles into a flattened swirl. The motions are chaotic at first, collisions, rebounds, spiraling paths that weave through each other like tangled threads. But slowly, the swirl begins to find order. The collisions become fewer, the paths smoother. Motion that once scattered begins to align. A disk is forming, thin, wide, and shimmering with drifting dust. It encircles the young fire like a ring of breath around a sleeping chest. The particles within it move in unison, guided by the curvature that deepens at the center. Each lap around the glowing core smooths the disk further, ironing out turbulence, teaching the cloud how to rotate as one. In the cooling outer regions of the disk, clumps begin to form, tiny gatherings of matter pulled together by their shared motion. They drift like small shadows, merging when they meet, growing heavier with each encounter. You watch as one such clump grows large enough to tug nearby particles into its orbit. It becomes a seed, a beginning, a promise that the disk will not remain empty. The early steps of world-making occur so quietly that even space itself listens. The fires at the centers of these disks continue to pulse, their gravity deepening, shaping the swirling clouds around them. The young universe is learning how to build more than flames. It is learning how to build homes for them. You drift outward from the swirling disk and feel the rhythm of countless other cradles repeating the same quiet dance across the vast dark. Each disk is different, shaped by its own history of collisions and tremors. Each one holds within it the first outlines of worlds to come. And that is where your next journey leads, into the moment when one of these swirling disks begins to form something larger, something round and restless, something that will one day call itself a planet. The swirling disk turns slowly beneath you, a great, thin river of dust and drifting fragments, circling the young fire at its center. The clumps within it, small at first, fragile and uncertain, continue their quiet collisions, merging in soft impacts that echo through the fabric like distant heartbeats. Each impact is a question. Each merging is an answer the universe gives with patient hands. You drift near one of these forming bodies, a cluster of grains that has grown heavy enough to pull others gently toward it. Its surface is uneven, cratered by the countless touches that have built it piece by piece. It spins slowly, not by choice, but because every collision, no matter how gentle, leaves behind a memory of momentum. Spin is becoming its language, and though it does not yet know the meaning, it repeats the word with every turn. Around it, the disk continues to spiral, delivering material as though feeding a growing infant. Dust settles across its surface like layers of forgotten snow. Pebbles rain down in quiet showers. Larger fragments graze its sides and, if captured, melt into its shape, becoming part of the forming world. Each impact warms it slightly, friction and pressure whispering hints of the fire that will one day burn deep within its core. The young body wobbles as it grows, its spin uneven, tugged by uneven mass and the drifting winds of the forming system. But even its wobble is temporary. With each addition of new weight, with each captured fragment, the body smooths its motion, slowly learning how to balance itself through the vast symphony of rotation. Then, within its center, a change begins. Pressure gathers, heat builds. Motion that once scattered now compresses inward, pulling the body towards spherical perfection. You can feel the shift as you drift closer. The outer fragments crumble, smoothing against the surface as gravity strengthens. The forming planet draws itself into a roundness that no stone sculptor could achieve, a shape carved solely by balance. The wobble fades, the spin steadies, the world learns its form. At the surface, the impacts continue. Some are small, no more than gentle taps that leave shallow impressions. Others arrive as blazing streaks, tearing through the young sky with heat and force, melting the outer crust into glowing seas. For a brief moment, an instant in cosmic time, the entire surface becomes liquid, a shimmering ocean of molten rock that reflects the faint light of the young star like a mirror made of fire. From this molten expanse, elements begin to separate. Heavy materials sink inward, falling toward the deepening core, while lighter ones float upward, cooling into a fragile crust. It is here, in this separation, that the planet begins to grow a heartbeat, not a biological pulse, but the rhythmic churn of heat trapped beneath solid skin. A convection of molten layers stirs beneath the surface, giving the world an inner life it does not yet understand. You drift above the forming crust, watching it crack and fold as the inner heat pushes upward. The crust is thin, almost delicate, a temporary shell destined to break again and again as the world cools and reshapes itself. But even in its fragility, it holds the promise of landscapes not yet formed, mountains that will rise, basins that will deepen, continents that will drift in silent choreography. Around the forming planet, smaller clumps continue to swirl, some destined to fall inward, others to escape, and a few to linger in the planet's gravitational embrace. One such fragment circles the world in a loose, uneven loop. Each pass tightens its path. Pulled by tides the young planet does not yet recognize as its own influence. The fragment grows warmer with each close approach, shedding debris that rains onto the planet's surface. Then, with a final pass, its orbit stabilizes. The planet has gained a companion. Small, rough, and battered, the moon to-be begins its silent vigil, circling the young world with a steadiness the planet itself has not yet mastered. Its gravity tugs gently at the forming oceans of molten rock, creating slow waves of motion deep within the surface. These tidal pulses travel inward, stirring the molten heart, teaching it new rhythms of motion and heat. You drift between the planet and its new moon. Feeling the subtle exchange between them, the planet slows slightly, giving some of its rotation to the companion that circles it. The moon drifts farther outward in response, learning how to keep its distance while still remaining bound to the world it now orbits. Their dance is imperfect, but it is the beginning of something stable, something lasting. The planet cools further, the molten seas dim, a crust forms again, thicker now, more resilient. Beneath it, the core continues to churn, stirring magnetic whispers into the dark. The world does not yet have an atmosphere. It does not yet have oceans. It does not yet carry the softness of life. But its foundations have been laid: the spin, the core, the gravity, the moon, the form. The universe has built a world, and as you drift upward, leaving behind the newborn planet glowing faintly beneath your feet, you sense the next question rising from the dark. How does a world that has learned its shape begin to learn its surface? And that is where your journey leads, next into the era when planets cool, weather forms, and the first landscapes breathe their silent contours into space. The young planet turns quietly beneath you, its surface cooling into dark stone that no longer glows with molten light. The crust thickens, settling into ridges and basins, forming vast plains where the heat below pushes gently but persistently against the solid skin above. You drift down toward the surface, and the silence here feels different, heavier, as though the world is waiting for something it cannot name. Above this cooling land, the emptiness is thin and sharp. Nothing softens the void. No winds sweep over the rock. No clouds gather. The sky is simply absence, a hollow dome of untouched darkness stretching endlessly overhead. The planet is complete in shape, but incomplete in presence. A world without a sky is a world without breath. Yet far beneath the crust, motion has not stopped. The molten heart continues to churn, releasing vapors trapped since the planet was born. These whispers of gas, water vapor, carbon dioxide, sulfur, and countless others rise slowly through the fractures that lace the cooling surface. They seep upward, invisible at first, then coalesce into faint exhalations drifting from the cracks in the stone. The planet begins to breathe. The early breaths are harsh, dense clouds of volcanic release rising in confused plumes. They thicken the emptiness above, layer by fragile layer. The air is still too thin to cling to the surface, still too hot to settle, but it carries weight now, a weight the planet must learn to hold. Gravity, steady and patient, pulls each rising molecule downward again and again, teaching the gases how to gather, how to rest, how to form the first outline of an atmosphere. You drift through these newborn vapors, feeling how they cling to the surface with unsteady determination. They swirl in slow eddies, shaped by the planet's rotation, by the uneven heat radiating from the crust, by the pull of the moon's distant orbit. The gases do not yet form weather. They merely drift, learning how to move, how to cool, how to become air. As the world rotates, the upper layers of vapor begin to stretch across the surface, thinning into endless sheets that glow faintly with reflected starlight. Each night, the heat trapped below escapes through these layers, cooling them further. Each dawn, they thicken slightly, losing some of their wildness. In time, the drifting vapors settle into the first sky thin, but present, a veil laid gently over the sleeping stone. Now the planet has an outline, not only of form, but of presence. It has a way to hold heat, a way to dim the harshness of the void, a way to soften the story of its own rotation. But the world is still restless. Heat wells up from deep fissures where the crust remains weak, sending towering plumes of gas surging into the young sky. These plumes collide with the thinning layers, stirring turbulence that sweeps across the surface in enormous, shapeless waves. The sky thickens further, darkening into a heavy blanket that traps heat and pressure. The planet warms again, not from fire within, but from the air it has created. Storms are born, not storms of wind and water, but storms of temperature and gas, immense and slow, spiraling over continents that have no names. They grind across the surface, smoothing rough stone into plains, lifting dust into the air, mixing the atmosphere until it becomes something closer to balance. You drift through one of these vast tempests, feeling the weight of the newborn sky pressing against itself, learning how to circulate. You sense rotation intertwining with heat, the first echoes of winds that will one day shape seas and seasons. But for now, the storms have no gentleness, only the raw force of a world discovering the limits of its own breath. Amid this turmoil, something extraordinary begins to happen. Within the thickening atmosphere, water vapor cools to the point of condensation. Droplets form too small to fall, too light to endure, trembling in suspension above the warm ground. They gather into clusters, then into larger beads, each one reflecting the glow of the forming sky like tiny mirrors. The first mist settles across the planet. It pools in low basins where the rock dips, gathering in thin sheets that shimmer under the faint starlight. These early pools are acidic, unstable, constantly evaporating and reforming as the atmosphere struggles to find equilibrium. But they are the beginnings of something immense. They are the first steps toward oceans. As these shallow waters spread, they give the air above them new patterns to follow. Evaporation draws heat upward, cooling the surface. Condensation returns that heat as rain. And though the first rains do not yet fall, the cycle is beginning to shape itself. The sky is learning rhythm. You rise above the mist and look out across the planet. It is no longer glowing, no longer molten, no longer silent. It has a surface now, and a breath, and a thin veil of clouds forming in timid arcs along its horizon. The young world is learning how to shelter itself, how to hold warmth without burning, how to cool without freezing. It is learning how to become a home, and as you drift upward, leaving the forming weather systems swirling below, you sense that this new world, with its first sky and its first waters, is ready for a new kind of motion, one that does not come from collapse or fire, but from cycles, from tides, from rotations measured not in glow, but in change. And that is where your journey leads next, into the dawn, when oceans form, continents drift, and a planet learns how to shape its own destiny. The mist thickens across the young planet, spreading through the valleys like transparent shadows. What began as scattered beads of condensed vapor now pools into wide, trembling sheets. The surface cools further, losing the harsh glow of its molten youth, and the air above it learns how to hold the weight of its new moisture. The planet breathes more steadily now, each exhale rising in soft plumes that cool just enough to return as dew. You drift above the widening basins where the first waters collect, watching them shimmer under the dim light. They are shallow, still, uncertain, slipping across the stone as though unsure where they belong. But gravity guides them, pulling them into lower ground, gathering them into larger pools that deepen with each passing rotation. These early waters do not rest. Heat still seeps from the depths below, stirring their surfaces, sending tremors of warmth upward to meet the cooling sky. The waters recoil, evaporate, fall again as mist. The cycle repeats until the pools grow heavy, too heavy to lift into vapor again. They settle at last into liquid, form dense, dark, and restless. The first oceans are born. Their surfaces dance in uneven rhythms, shaped by the planet's spin, by heat rising from beneath, and by the faint tug of the moon circling overhead. The oceans learn to sway before they learn to crash, their movements soft but insistent, lifting and lowering, as though attempting to mimic the pulse of the molten heart still beating deep within the planet. You drift low over the waves and feel the motion gathering strength. Each swell pushes the next, the water learning how to rhythmically shift its weight across the surface. The oceans are young, too warm, too full of dissolved minerals, too volatile to settle, but they are forming their identity. They are the first systems on this world to move entirely on their own, driven not by collapse or fire, but by cycles that echo the rotation of the world itself. Across the planet, currents begin to form, not yet the structured streams that will one day sculpt climates, but simple flows formed by temperature differences. Hot waters rising, cold waters sinking. These circulations pull entire regions of the ocean into slow spirals, smoothing their surfaces while shaping the stone beneath. In places where the crust cools unevenly, fissures release bursts of heat that billow into the water, sending clouds of minerals swirling like drifting ink. These underwater storms are silent, unseen from above, yet they sculpt the early ocean floor with surprising patience. They carve channels, pile sediment, move fragments of rock across the seabed. The world is learning that water does not simply fill space, it reshapes it. As you rise higher, the oceans spread out before you, like vast, shifting mirrors, their surfaces textured by the first true winds. The atmosphere has thickened enough now to form currents of its own, pushing across the waters in long, slow breaths. These winds trace the rotation of the planet, guiding the waves into patterns that ripple toward the forming coastlines. Where waves meet newly cooled rock, the stone crumbles. The water lifts grain after grain, carrying them away, smoothing what was once jagged into something softer. The land learns to kneel beneath the ocean's touch. The ocean learns to carve its name into the shape of the world. But the world itself is not still. Far below the crust, the molten heart churns, pushing continents apart before they even have the chance to settle. Ridges rise along the ocean floor, where magma surges upward, creating newborn mountains that stretch like spines through the deep. Other regions sink slowly, collapsing under their own weight, making room for deeper seas. The planet is learning tectonics. This movement reshapes coastlines as quickly as the water can carve them, creating a restless dance between land and sea. One region rises from the deep, shedding water like a newborn creature struggling to breathe above the waves. Another sinks quietly, beneath the weight of currents that have flowed for only a few thousand rotations. The oceans follow these changes faithfully, adjusting their boundaries with each new tremor. Above these shifting waters, the sky has grown darker and heavier. Clouds gather more easily now, thick with moisture drawn from the oceans below. For the first time, true rain begins to fall, not the delicate mist of earlier days, but full, heavy drops that strike the surface with weight. They feed the oceans, swell the rivers, and cool the land in long, wandering streaks. The world has entered a new cycle: evaporation, condensation, rain, runoff, ocean, each part feeding the next. The planet is learning how to refresh itself, how to move energy not just through collapse, but through repetition. The oceans pulse with tides driven by the moon's steady pull. Currents circle the globe, weaving through the depths. Winds spiral above them, uncurling across the horizons. A world is learning motion in layers. You drift above the rolling waves, feeling the breath of the planet move beneath you in rhythms that echo the earliest tremors of the universe itself. The oceans swell, fall, swirl, and rise again, never still, never silent, no longer bound only by gravity but by cycles that signal the beginning of weather, climate, and change. And as you rise toward the dim sky, leaving the restless waters behind, you sense the next chapter waiting to unfold. A world that has learned motion must now learn variation, heat and cold, storms and calm, seasons that guide the future shape of the world. And that is where your journey leads next, into the era when a planet discovers how to shift its face through time. The oceans roll steadily beneath you as you rise above them, their silver-blue surfaces shifting with the slow confidence of a world learning how to breathe. The young planet has found its rhythm, winds tracing arcs across waters, currents spiraling through the deep, rains falling in long, shimmering lines. Motion has taken root, cycles have begun, but a world shaped only by repetition cannot yet learn transformation. For transformation, it must tilt. And so, almost imperceptibly, the planet leans. It is not a deliberate act. The tilt emerges from countless small coincidences: the tug of its newborn moon, the uneven cooling of its rocky body, the invisible pushes imparted during its chaotic youth. Yet the effect is profound. The planet no longer presents itself evenly to its star. One hemisphere leans forward, then the other, greeting and retreating from the warmth in a long, patient cycle. Light changes, not in intensity, but in presence. Days lengthen on one side, shortening on the other. The oceans warm unevenly, their surfaces stirred into new patterns by the shifting heat. Winds that once traced simple loops now bend into more complex spirals, carrying warmth from one region to another, guiding the earliest hints of climate across the forming continents. You drift over a region where the tilt's influence is sharpest. The sun's light lingers here, pressing into the land with a persistence it has never known before. The surface warms and the warm air rises, carrying moisture from the ocean's inland. Clouds gather, heavy and dense, releasing rain across the rocky plains in long, slow sheets. Rivers carve deeper paths toward the sea. Valleys widen, the land softens beneath the touch of the weather it has summoned. Half a world away, the opposite hemisphere cools. The sun climbs lower in that distant sky, casting long blue shadows across regions where the air grows sharper and stiller. The oceans there exhale less vapor, clouds thin, rain becomes rare. The land hardens, etched by winds that carry the faint chill of the cooling seas. Here, weather does not flow, it crouches, learning the contours of silence. Two hemispheres, one planet. One warmed, one cooled, each responding to the tilt in a slow, sweeping conversation that will continue for billions of years. The world is learning seasons. You drift between the hemispheres, feeling the temperature gradient as a soft, expanding tide. Hot rising, cold sinking. Warmth pulled toward darkness, darkness folding into light. The planet is learning contrast, how to hold both abundance and austerity, how to let each prepare the way for the other. As the seasons deepen, the oceans respond with greater certainty. Warm currents surge from the sunlit hemisphere, drifting toward cooler waters with immense momentum. These currents wrap around the planet like veins, delivering heat to frozen regions and absorbing cold in return. The result is a global pulse, a circulation that shapes not only the seas but the air above them. Storms become more defined, not as chaotic eruptions, but as organized dances of temperature and pressure. Those that rise in the heated hemisphere sweep toward cooler regions, gathering strength as they meet contrasting winds. Their swirling forms carve the sky into spirals that echo the earliest curves of spacetime, a reminder that motion remembers where it came from. On land, the seasons leave deeper scars. In warm periods, rivers swell and spread, cutting through stone to carve canyons that stretch like open wounds. In colder intervals, the rain retreats, leaving dry plains patterned with cracks where water once ran. Rocks fracture beneath the cycle of heat and cold, slowly breaking into sediment that washes into the sea. Even without life, the land is alive with change. And yet, the tilt's influence is not merely surface deep. The variations of heat and cold affect the crust itself. Tectonic plates, driven by the molten heart beneath, respond to shifting weight with subtle adjustments. Mountain ranges lift, trenches deepen, volcanoes pulse with renewed motion, releasing gas into the sky that thickens the atmosphere further, stabilizing the planet's growing climate engine. Seasons have become more than fluctuations of light. They are the heartbeat of a world. You rise higher, watching the planet turn beneath you. The changes are slow, but not silent. Every rotation is a revision. Every circuit around its star adds a new chapter to the shaping of the surface. The world is not simply enduring these cycles, it is sculpting itself through them. The seasons teach the planet resilience. They teach it pattern. They teach it the value of imbalance as a force of transformation. And as the world grows more stable in its tilt, as the dance of warm and cold builds the landscapes that will define its future, you sense that the planet has reached a threshold. It has learned how to change. It has learned how to evolve. And now it stands ready for a deeper lesson, the lesson of chemistry, complexity, and the quiet alchemy that will one day turn its oceans from simple water into something capable of remembering itself. And that is where your journey leads next, into the moment when a world discovers the first whispers of organic possibility. The seasons turn with slow confidence as the planet circles its young star, each rotation carrying warmth and cold across the surface in long, sweeping arcs. The oceans have grown deep now, spreading across vast basins and reaching into countless valleys. Their surfaces ripple beneath shifting skies, stirred by winds that follow the planet's tilt, like dancers tracing a familiar pattern. But beneath the waves, in darkness untouched by storms or sunlight, something more intricate is beginning to unfold. The ocean floor still trembles with the energy of a molten world. Fissures open and close in quiet rhythms, releasing streams of heat into the surrounding water. These currents rise in dark plumes, rich with minerals drawn from the churning mantle below. They carry whispers of metal, sulfur, and carbon raw ingredients that drift upward like the smoke of an ancient forge. As these plumes meet the cooler waters above, the minerals within them crystallize, forming chimneys of stone that grow upward from the seafloor. Their walls shimmer with layers of newly formed material, fragile as frost, yet enduring in the deep. Water flows through them constantly, heated and cooled in cycles that create pockets of turbulence within the stone. These pockets become chambers, tiny rooms carved by chemistry, each one a crucible where temperature and pressure shift in delicate patterns. You drift closer, feeling the heat of a rising plume brush against the surrounding chill. The chamber walls thrum with gradients, warm currents pushing outward, cold water pressing inward. In these gradients, molecules collide, break apart, reassemble, and begin to settle into new configurations. They are not yet complex, not yet alive, but they are learning how to persist. Within the tiny chambers, simple compounds link together more readily than they break apart. Patterns emerge in their interactions, cycles of reaction and release, repetition and renewal. The molecules begin to favor certain shapes, certain arrangements, as though the environment is whispering suggestions to them. Some of these shapes form membranes, thin films that divide one region of fluid from another. They wobble, unstable, forming and dissolving like thoughts that cannot quite hold themselves in place. But each time they reform, they last a little longer, strengthened by the very environment that threatens to tear them apart. The planet is performing alchemy in the dark. Above, the oceans swirl peacefully, unaware of the delicate structures forming below. Tides pull at the surface, winds sculpt the waves, and sunlight paints fleeting patterns across the water. Yet none of these movements reach the quiet drama unfolding in the mineral chimneys, where chemistry is beginning to organize itself into something more than chance. As the cycles continue, some chambers grow more stable. They maintain consistent gradients, enabling certain reactions to run more efficiently. Others collapse, leaving behind fragments that drift upward as nutrients for neighboring vents. The entire system hums with the energy of change, not chaotic, but exploratory, like fingers tapping out new rhythms on a drum, only just invented. You slip inside one of the larger chimneys, floating among the swirling molecules. The walls glow faintly from mineral deposits that shift colors with the changing temperature. Tiny pockets of trapped fluid flicker with microscopic activity as new compounds form, break, and reform in endless permutations. In one pocket, a chain of molecules twists into a shape capable of holding a pattern fragile, temporary, but more structured than anything before it. This pattern repeats itself as conditions allow, guiding nearby molecules into similar arrangements. The ocean is learning how to remember. Memory leads to replication. Replication leads to persistence. Persistence leads to possibility. It is not yet life, but it is the architecture upon which life will be built. The first whispers of complexity, rising from the simplest motions of chemistry. The ocean has not only gathered its waters, it has begun to gather intention, drawn from gradients, heat, and the restless creativity of a planet still cooling into stability. You drift upward from the vent, watching the dark plumes billow through the water like breath from the planet's hidden lungs. The chemicals spiral and dissolve, carried by currents that spread them across the seabed. Each molecule, each fragment, each unstable pattern will play its part in the slow symphony of emergence. For now, these processes remain contained in the deep, invisible to the surface world. But as time stretches forward, as seasons continue to weave their patterns through air and water, these fragile structures will accumulate, evolve, and refine themselves. They will build upon each other, forming networks that can adapt, respond, and eventually awaken. The oceans are dreaming, and the dream is growing clearer. As you rise toward the faint glow of the surface, leaving the chimneys behind, you sense the next chapter unfolding not just complexity, but organization, not just chemistry, but behavior. And that is where your journey leads. Next, into the moment when the first true precursors to life begin to shape themselves from the restless memory of the sea. The chimneys fade into the darkness below as you drift upward through the slow-moving layers of the ocean. The water grows cooler, quieter, more still. Yet even here, away from the heat and turbulence of the vents, the restless chemistry continues its quiet experiment. Patterns formed in the deep do not vanish. When carried upward, they drift, they dissolve, they recombine. The ocean is not a single place. It is an endless field of conditions, each one testing the shapes born in the dark. A thin current draws you toward a region where the water is neither warm nor cold, neither turbulent nor still. It is a corridor of delicate balance, where molecules can linger long enough to encounter one another without being scattered apart. In this gentler realm, the patterns formed near the vents begin to reveal something new. Some of the fragile chains you saw earlier drift into this zone, their structures unstable yet persistent. They twist in ways that attract certain molecules more readily than others, holding them in place long enough for reactions to occur. Some chains fold, exposing one surface to the water while hiding another. Others arrange themselves into spirals, their shapes creating small pockets where chemistry can happen in seclusion. These shapes begin to matter, not because they are alive, but because they influence their own surroundings. A pattern that attracts complementary molecules survives longer than one that does not. A chain that folds in a stable way endures more cycles of temperature and pressure. A spiral that shelters fragile bonds allows new patterns to form within its coil. The ocean is learning preference. From preference comes selection, not conscious, but inevitable. You drift near a cluster of these forming chains. They sway gently, caught in a slow current that brings new molecules into their reach. One chain, curved like a crescent, binds with a nearby fragment, stabilizing itself in the process. Another, stretched thin, breaks apart when struck by a drifting mineral grain, leaving smaller pieces that scatter into the dark. Survival, in these early waters, is not measured by strength but by compatibility. Time in this region is slow. Cycles of heating, cooling, drifting, and mixing pass without urgency, but the patterns accumulate. Some chains form crude membranes, thin, film-like structures that envelope pockets of water. These membranes are porous, fragile, and often temporary. But, occasionally, one closes entirely, trapping a mixture inside. A boundary has formed. Inside these primitive enclosures, the molecules are no longer free to drift away. Reactions occur more frequently, guided by proximity rather than chance. Energy flows through the membranes in gradients, sparking new chemistry that would never occur in the open sea. Some enclosures collapse immediately, undone by turbulence or instability. Others endure longer, their contents shifting into arrangements that mimic the structures outside, but with slight differences. These differences matter. You watch as one such enclosure divides not gracefully, nor with precision, but with enough coherence that both halves retain some of the original pattern. They drift apart, trembling in the current, and begin accumulating new molecules from the water around them. The shapes inside each half gradually regain their complexity, echoing the form of the original. It is not reproduction, not truly, but it is repetition. A pattern is learning how to persist through duplication, even if clumsy and incomplete. The ocean, once filled with directionless chemistry, now holds clusters of self-maintaining processes. Their survival depends entirely on stability, on chance, on conditions they cannot influence. And yet some endure. Some last longer than others. Some grow, shrink, divide, and drift. The planet's cycles amplify this new order. Tides stir the waters, mixing regions that were once isolated. Rainfall cools certain zones, concentrating key molecules. Undersea currents carry mineral-rich plumes into unexpected places. Everywhere, conditions shift, and patterns adapt or vanish. The oceans are no longer merely dreaming in chemistry. They are experimenting. They are remembering. They are beginning to imitate themselves. And as you rise toward the faint shimmer of sunlight filtering through the upper layers, you sense the next turn in the story. The patterns drifting below have not yet become life, but they now possess a crucial trait, the ability to endure through imitation. That endurance will shape everything to come, and that is where your journey leads next, into the moment when repetition becomes refinement and the boundary between chemistry and life begins to dissolve. The sunlight above fades into muted blue as you drift deeper again, into the quiet corridor where patterns glide like drifting thoughts. They sway softly in the slow currents, caught between steadiness and dissolution. The primitive membranes formed in the earlier ages still float here, trembling with each encounter, dividing, merging, collapsing, yet always reforming in new shapes that echo the old. But something has changed. The patterns that once simply repeated themselves now begin to diverge. Each replication, each enclosure, each merging leaves behind small differences, gaps in structure, rearranged fragments, additional molecules slipping into the folds. The ocean does not preserve perfection. It allows variation, and variation begins to matter more than survival itself. You drift near a membrane that is just divided. Its two halves drift slowly apart, like siblings that resemble each other but share no destiny. Inside one, a chain of molecules coils into a compact spiral, forming a shape more stable than the original. Inside the other, the same chain unfurls slightly, exposing regions that attract different molecules. Both patterns carry the memory of the first enclosure, but each follows a different path. Imperfection has entered the ocean. It is a quiet entrance, no shift in light, no change in temperature, no sign that the world has crossed a threshold. But the consequences ripple through the water like a silent wave. Variations that once passed unnoticed now influence how patterns grow, how membranes stabilize, how cycles proceed. Some differences make structures more resilient, others weaken them, but all of them add diversity to the drifting clusters. You drift alongside a membrane that carries a particularly unusual variation. Its inner molecules have learned to use the gradient across its boundary to fuel small movements within the enclosure. They cluster near the warmer side when the surrounding currents shift, reorganizing themselves in a subtle, purposeful flow. It is not intention, it is not will, but it is behavior. The ocean begins to mimic decision-making. In another enclosure, molecules form a network that breaks apart and reconstructs itself repeatedly in the span of a single cycle. Each reconstruction is slightly different, shaped by the fragments available at the moment. The network becomes more flexible, better able to withstand the turbulence that would have destroyed it before. Flexibility becomes a new advantage. Everywhere you float, you see variations building upon variations. Some enclosures have thicker boundaries, protecting their interiors from sudden shifts in temperature. Others develop porous membranes that allow certain molecules to enter and leave, creating the first primitive exchange with the world outside. These exchanges grow more complex, more selective, forming rudimentary systems of intake and release. The ocean is learning adaptation, and adaptation requires imperfection. Within one drifting enclosure, you sense a series of reactions unfolding in a sequence, each step dependent on the previous, each producing compounds that feed the next. It is a delicate chain of events, vulnerable to collapse, yet astonishing in its coherence. The sequence does not merely repeat, it improves. Slight changes make reactions faster. Slight differences increase stability. The enclosure becomes a small workshop of evolving chemistry. You rise toward the midwaters, where particles of mineral dust and fragments of ancient chains drift in slow spirals. These drifting remnants collide with membranes and influence their reactions, adding new possibilities to the networks inside. Some enclosures incorporate the foreign pieces into their cycles. Others reject them and collapse. Chance shapes the fate of each. But chance is no longer alone in guiding survival. The enclosures that persist not only endure, they refine themselves. They become better at gathering nutrients, better at holding together, better at protecting their inner patterns. They are still not alive, but they are no longer merely chemistry. They are becoming systems organized, responsive, and increasingly complex. As you drift higher, the sunlight dims into a soft gold that filters through the waters. The surface world moves with quiet regularity, winds crossing the seas, storms forming along coastlines, rains feeding the cycles below. The stability above brings new consistency to the world beneath. Less chaos, fewer extremes. More opportunities for the drifting enclosures to survive long enough to refine themselves further. The ocean has become a laboratory where imperfection is the catalyst. Variation builds possibility. Possibility fuels complexity. Complexity inches towards something that has not yet existed here. A structure that can not only imitate itself, but correct itself. A structure that can anticipate. A structure that can respond with purpose. You pause in the rising waters, sensing the next turning point not as a dramatic shift, but as a deepening. The patterns drifting around you have reached a threshold. They are no longer content to survive by chance. Their variations have begun to give them agency, primitive, fragile, unknowing, but unmistakable. And that is where your journey leads, next into the moment when chemistry steps across the faint boundary into the first spark of life. The waters around you shimmer with drifting membranes, each one carrying the quiet memory of cycles repeated through countless seasons. They glide through the cycles, currents like fragile lanterns, casting faint shadows across the mineral-rich depths. Variations have spread widely now. Some enclosures wobble in unstable shapes, others hold steady with remarkable resilience. But all of them share a lineage born of the same restless chemistry. You drift toward a cluster where the water moves with subtle order, as if drawn toward a rhythm it does not yet understand. Within this region, the membranes float closer together, pulled not by gravity, but by gradients of heat, salinity, and the faint electric whispers created by interacting molecules. Their dances are no longer solitary. Their presence influences one another, guiding collisions that bring new possibilities to life. One enclosure, larger than most, trembles as you approach. Inside it, the molecular network has become unusually dense threads of chemistry looping through themselves in intricate cycles. They break and reform with astonishing speed, using the gradients across the proper membrane with greater efficiency than the surrounding patterns. Each cycle produces compounds that stabilize the next. Each reaction leaves behind a trace that encourages new ones to form. It is a coherent storm of motion, contained within a trembling bubble of film, not alive, but no longer merely drifting. A spark of order pulses inside it, expanding and contracting like the nervous heartbeat of something preparing to awaken. You drift closer, sensing how the membrane thickens in response to the growing internal complexity. It repairs itself when stretched. It incorporates new molecules into its structure when damaged. It selects crudely but unmistakably what it allows to pass through. The boundary has learned to protect its interior. Inside that protected space, molecules replicate with uneven fidelity. Some copies are imperfect, but these imperfections grant new capabilities. Some enhance stability. Others increase reaction speed. A few break the cycles entirely, but the enclosure now has enough redundancy to survive the loss. The system is no longer fragile, it is becoming robust. And then, something new happens. A chain inside the enclosure folds into a shape capable of catalyzing a reaction, speeding it up dramatically, guiding it with precision rather than chance. The reaction feeds another chain that stabilizes the membrane. That stabilization strengthens the gradient that powers the catalyst. A loop forms a feedback that sustains itself. The enclosure has learned persistence. You feel the shift in the water, an almost imperceptible vibration, as the internal cycles synchronize. channeling energy in a way no pattern has done before. It is still blind, still unaware, still subject to the whims of environment. Yet it holds a quality the others lack: the ability to continue, not because conditions allow it, but because it has become an engine of its own survival. Nearby enclosures drift close, some collapsing from instability, others carrying their own early cycles. But none possess the coherence of this one. It moves with purpose, not self-directed, not chosen, but guided by the strength of its internal loops. It swims without muscles. It navigates without intention. It drifts toward gradients where it can feed its reactions more efficiently. Chemistry has begun to move as though it wants. You watch as the enclosure divides, no longer a clumsy splitting by pressure, but a controlled process. The membrane stretches, narrows, and pinches inward, guided by internal reactions that coordinate just enough to shape the division. Two halves form, each containing part of the original network. They drift apart, holding the memory of the cycles that birthed them. This time, the patterns do not fade, they continue. Across the water, more enclosures follow similar paths. Some succeed, many fail. But the ocean does not require perfection. It requires persistence. And persistence is becoming common. The once random variations have accumulated into systems that can survive pressure, temperature shifts, and the slow, wandering tides. The water you float through now whispers with the faint hum of self-maintaining order. The spark inside each growing system glows brighter, not with light, but with coherence, like stars forming not from fire, but from organization. The planet has crossed a threshold in silence. Life, not conscious, not complex, but unmistakably alive, has begun to take root. And as you rise gently toward the faint shimmer of sun, filtering from above, you sense the next unfolding. Life will not remain small. It will not remain simple. The spark that learned to hold itself together will soon learn to change, to compete, to branch into forms unimagined in these quiet waters. And that is where your journey leads next, into the era when life multiplies, diversifies, and begins shaping the world that shaped it. The young ocean carries its new inhabitants quietly, as if unsure how to cradle something so delicate. The first living enclosures drift through its depths with rhythms shaped by chemistry, by gradients, by chance, but no longer by chance alone. They divide, merge, break, and reform in patterns that echo through the water, like the earliest verse of a song, still learning its melody. You drift among them as the sun's faint glow filters into the upper layers. The light does not reach deep enough to feed them, not yet, but its presence stirs the water, warming currents that lift the living clusters upward. They swirl gently in this rising tide, gathering in regions where temperature, minerals, and movement meet in quiet harmony. Repetition becomes abundance. The enclosures that once counted their lineage in single digits now drift in swarms, each one carrying a thread of the ancient spark that taught them persistence. Their membranes have grown more complex, strengthening in response to pressures that once tore them apart. Their interiors hum with reactions that run in coordinated cycles, producing molecules that feed the next generation. Some of these cycles improve by accident. A small change in structure leads to faster replication. A tiny divergence grants resistance to heat. A new fold in a catalytic chain increases efficiency. The variations that once threatened stability now fuel diversity. The ocean is learning to fill itself. You watch as one cluster of living enclosures gathers near a warm current rising from the deep. They drift into the upward flow, dividing rapidly, each generation building upon the success of the last. Soon the water shimmers with their presence, their numbers transforming the current into a river of life that carries them across the planet. Elsewhere, in cooler regions, other clusters thrive for different reasons. They grow slowly but endure longer, their stable cycles resisting the fluctuations that overwhelm their faster-growing cousins. Their patience grants them strength. Their caution grants them longevity. Diversity becomes strategy. The world is no longer guided only by seasons and tides. It is being shaped by life itself, gently, quietly, but undeniably. You drift closer to one particularly dense region where countless living enclosures crowd together. They compete for space, for nutrients, for gradients that support their internal rhythms. Some succeed, others perish. Yet even in death, they contribute, releasing molecules that nourish those still holding together. Life begins to recycle life. As clusters grow, they cast tiny shadows on the water around them, altering the flow of molecules in ways that create new opportunities. Some enclosures evolve channels along their membranes, primitive pathways that guide nutrients more efficiently. Others develop rudimentary chemical senses, responding to gradients with newfound precision. They drift not randomly, but directionally. Life is learning to move with intention. In the shallower regions, where sunlight penetrates more deeply, a new transformation begins. Certain molecular chains inside a handful of enclosures react differently to the light absorbing it, shifting its energy into chemical forms that feed their cycles. These enclosures grow faster, divide more efficiently, and linger near illuminated waters as though drawn by instinct. Light becomes nourishment. The ocean changes in response. Gradients deepen. Competition intensifies. The gentle drift of earlier eras gives way to a quiet struggle for survival. Not violent, not brutal, but persistent, shaping each lineage with every cycle of replication. You drift through these living currents, sensing how the ocean has become a dynamic system of interactions, no longer defined solely by the planet's physics. Life has become an active presence, influencing the chemistry of the water, altering the pathways of nutrients, contributing its own rhythms to the pulse of the world. The spark that once flickered in a single enclosure now glows everywhere, scattered through the sea like stars reflected in an endless mirror. The planet carries these sparks gently, unaware that they will one day conquer every corner of its surface. As you ascend toward the glowing surface, the sun's reflection dances across the waves. The world feels fuller now, not just a planet with oceans, but a world with a growing identity. Life has learned to multiply, but multiplication is only the beginning. The next transformation will be far deeper. Life will learn to cooperate, to specialize, to merge its strengths into structures greater than any single enclosure. And that is where your journey leads next, into the era when living systems begin to join, shaping the first communities of complexity. The living currents thicken beneath you as you drift once more through the glowing layers of the ocean. The waters no longer feel empty. They carry purpose, woven through countless tiny enclosures that pulse with their own fragile rhythms. They divide, compete, drift, and fade in patterns as ancient as the tremors that shape the universe itself. But something new is rising among them. Each enclosure, once solitary, begins to feel the presence of others more deeply, not through awareness, but through chemistry. Nutrients released by one become fuel for another. Waste from one reaction sparks a new cycle in its neighbor. Gradients shift where clusters gather, creating microenvironments that favor those who can take advantage of shared conditions. Life begins to influence its surroundings not only in passing, but deliberately, through the quiet accumulation of countless small actions. You drift toward a region where the water is rich with these interactions. Here, enclosures cluster more tightly than before, drawn together by gradients they themselves have created. Their membranes brush softly against one another, exchanging molecules through tiny pores that open and close with primitive precision. What was once competition becomes opportunity, each enclosure benefiting from the presence of its neighbors. Some of these clusters stabilize into loose assemblies. They are not true organisms, not yet, but they behave like something more than individuals. When one enclosure falters, the molecules it releases help others survive. When one flourishes, It enriches the environment for those around it. Patterns of mutual benefit arise spontaneously, weaving the first hints of cooperation into the fabric of the ocean. Life is beginning to form communities. Among these clusters, a new kind of enclosure emerges, larger, more complex, with internal cycles so refined that it can process nutrients more efficiently than any of its neighbors. But rather than dominating, it draws others toward it. Some attach themselves to its membrane, feeding on the molecules it releases. Others shelter in the gradient that forms around its surface, benefiting from the stable conditions it maintains. The large enclosure does not reject them. Its structure becomes stronger with the help of those that cling to it. Their presence stabilizes its membrane, modulates its reactions, even protects it from sudden changes in temperature or salinity. The smaller enclosures, once independent, now thrive best when attached to a larger host. A new kind of partnership is forming, symbiosis in its earliest form. You drift closer and feel the subtle exchanges between them. Molecules pass in both directions, guided not by intent, but by compatibility. The boundaries blur, not dissolving, but aligning. The host absorbs certain enclosures into its interior, not destroying them, but allowing them to carry out their own cycles within its protective shell. Their contributions strengthen the host, and the host's stability grants them a safer home. Life has discovered integration. Elsewhere in the ocean, assemblies grow more ambitious. Clusters of similar enclosures gather into filaments, long chains that move through the water as single units. These chains sway in the currents with surprising grace, bending and curling as though practicing the earliest choreography of movement. When one unit divides, the chain grows longer. When one dies, the chain heals around the absence. Cooperation becomes structure. You drift through a vast, shimmering sheet of these chains, stretching across the water like an emerging fabric. They rise toward the light, drawn by the energy that fuels certain reactions. The sheet undulates with the waves, forming patterns more complex than any enclosure could achieve alone. Where sunlight is brightest, the sheet thickens, and the enclosures within it divide rapidly. Where shadows fall, the sheet thins, conserving energy by withdrawing into deeper waters. The ocean has begun to shape itself around these communities. Currents shift to accommodate them. Nutrient flows adjust. Entire regions become defined by the presence of particular networks, zones where certain partnerships thrive. Life no longer drifts alone. It gathers, it bonds, it influences. Its presence carves invisible landscapes through the sea. As you rise above this shimmering world, you see the planet growing quieter in its own way. The violent storms of its youth have softened. The crust has settled. The atmosphere has matured. The world is preparing for a new chapter, one where life will no longer be confined to simple forms or single functions. The cooperative clusters below hold the blueprint for what comes next. Cells that once drifted alone will soon merge their talents into singular entities. Functions will specialize. Compartments will appear. The first true organisms, complex, deliberate, self-regulating, will begin to rise from the quiet symphonies of partnership. Life is learning not only how to survive, but how to become more. And as you drift upward, feeling the hum of cooperation spreading across the oceans, you sense the next transformation approaching, the birth of complexity, of cells within cells, of systems that hold more potential than any single spark could contain. And that is where your journey leads next, into the moment when life merges its strengths and begins to assemble the first ancestors of all future creatures. The ocean hums with the quiet pulse of cooperation as you drift once more through its luminous layers. The clusters below no longer behave like scattered fragments of chemistry. They move in loose harmony, forming chains, sheets, and drifting webs that shape the currents around them. What began as solitary sparks of persistence has grown into something communal, a tapestry of living systems learning to share strength. But beneath this expanding collaboration lies a deeper transformation, one unfolding in silence within individual enclosures. Some of the larger, more intricate cells carry tiny companions within their membranes. These companions were once independent, small, efficient enclosures that drifted freely through the water, feeding on gradients and releasing energy into the sea. But over time, drawn by compatibility and protected by the shelter of larger hosts, they found refuge inside. At first, their presence was accidental. A small enclosure might slip through a weak spot in a host membrane, becoming trapped within. Sometimes the host collapsed, unable to maintain the unexpected burden. But sometimes, extraordinarily, their cycles aligned. The smaller enclosure continued its reactions inside the host, processing nutrients and releasing energy in ways that benefited both. The host gained a steady source of fuel. The companion gained stability and protection. A new kind of bond emerged, one deeper than cooperation, more intimate than symbiosis. You drift closer to these paired systems. Inside them, reactions run with precise coordination. The host cell divides more steadily, guided by the energy produced internally. The companion divides within it, ensuring both lineages persist together. Over time, the boundary between them grows less rigid. The host begins to rely on the energy it receives. The companion evolves to produce it more efficiently. Two cells that once drifted alone have become one. You watch this process repeat across the ocean. Small energetic enclosures embed themselves within larger cells, slowly transforming into the engines that power them. Other companions develop different roles, processing waste, stabilizing membranes, storing nutrients. Life has begun to divide its labor internally, giving rise to compartments, to specialization, to the earliest organelles. Complexity is no longer something that forms between cells. It forms inside them. As you drift upward, you pass through waters shimmering with larger, more capable organisms. Their membranes ripple with structures unseen in earlier eras, channels that transport molecules with precision, scaffolds that hold reactions in place, frameworks that allow the cell to change shape and direction. Some glide through the water using thin appendages powered by internal engines. Others extend branching surfaces to capture nutrients more effectively. Life is learning architecture. Inside a single cell, thousands of reactions coordinate with a rhythm far beyond the chaotic chemistry of the vents below. Networks form loops of action and response that allow the cell to sense its environment, adjust its processes, and store energy for future cycles. The boundary between inner and outer worlds grows sharper, more deliberate. The cell becomes a microcosm, an entire, self-maintaining world, contained within a fragile membrane. The ocean reacts in turn. Nutrient flows shift as complex organisms graze on simpler ones. Gradients sharpen where living communities concentrate, creating new opportunities for adaptation. The waters fill with biological structures, waste, nutrients, fragments of membranes that reshape the chemical landscape of the planet. Life has begun to feed on life, not cruelly, not consciously, but as a natural consequence of complexity increasing. Organisms able to break down the structures of others gain access to concentrated energy. Some develop mechanisms to envelop neighboring cells, drawing them inward and digesting them in sheltered chambers. Others evolve defensive strategies, thicker membranes, chemical deterrence, rapid division. Every new strategy is met with a counter-strategy. The ocean becomes an arena of innovation. And yet, despite this growing tension, cooperation persists. Communities of cells gather into colonies that move as one. They form filaments that coordinate their growth, sheets that ripple with synchronized behavior, clusters that build shared protective layers. Some cells specialize anchoring the colony, moving nutrients, sensing light, becoming parts of a larger whole. Multicellularity has begun to whisper through the water. You drift above a particularly large colony, its surface shimmering with thousands of coordinated cells. They sway in the current like a single organism, each cell guided by chemical signals that move across the colony like waves. When a shadow passes overhead, cells at the surface contract, signaling those beneath to adjust. When nutrients drift near, the colony shifts as one, feeding collectively. A new kind of organism is forming, not a single cell, not yet a complex creature, but the first outline of a body. The planet is changing once more. Life, once bound by simplicity, is discovering the power of unity. Cells within cells, cells beside cells, cells communicating through gradients and signals carried across microscopic distances, an intricate dance of interdependence that hints at shapes not yet imagined. As you drift toward the dimming surface, leaving the swelling communities below, you sense the next threshold rising like a tide. Life will not stay microscopic. It will learn shape. It will learn structure. It will begin to sculpt forms that move, breathe, and transform the world above as deeply as chemistry once did below. And that is where your journey leads, next into the moment when life builds bodies, and the oceans awaken with creatures that reshape the planet's destiny. The ocean deepens into a living tapestry as you return to its middle layers, the water warm with the energy of countless cells moving, dividing, and building upon the complexity they now carry within. What once drifted alone has learned to cling, to cluster, to integrate, to cooperate. Tiny worlds inside tiny membranes have merged their strengths until a single cell can hold entire systems within it. But the ocean is not finished teaching. The clusters that formed in earlier eras, loose assemblies of cooperation, begin to tighten their unity. Chemical signals pulse between neighboring cells, guiding them to divide at specific angles, to attach in specific sequences, to organize themselves into structures that behave like singular organisms. The first bodies begin as simple filaments. Long chains of cells line up end to end, moving as one through the currents. They undulate softly, steering their collective shape toward light, warmth, or nutrients. Each cell senses only its nearest neighbors, yet together they behave with a cohesion no single cell could achieve. From filaments, sheets emerge. Thin, flexible mats of cells spread across the water, rippling like living fabric beneath the surface. They fold and curl, creating sheltered pockets where finer gradients form. Within these pockets, chemistry shifts again, some cells specializing in capturing energy, others in processing nutrients, others still in binding the sheet together with subtle adhesive molecules. You drift near one such sheet, feeling the faint electric murmurs traveling across its surface. These signals coordinate action, allowing the sheet to contract toward richer waters or to relax when danger shifts near. The sheet is not conscious, but it behaves with an emerging unity, each part responding to the whole in a rhythm that resembles intention. Cooperation is beginning to solidify into identity. Elsewhere, colonies begin to build spheres, clusters that curve inward to enclose inner chambers. In these hollow bodies, the inner cells experience different conditions from those on the surface, so they evolve differently. Some lose the ability to divide. Others specialize in sensing. Still others become engines of motion, stirring the water with cilia or primitive paddles. Specialization becomes structure. The sphere rotates gently in the current, guided by cells that have developed the ability to detect gradients in light or chemicals. The sphere turns toward nourishment, then away from harshness, navigating as though guided by thought, the first echo of behavior that hints at the future of perception. But the ocean holds even more ambitious designs. Some colonies begin to thread their filaments through layers of extracellular material, weaving scaffolds around which cells can cluster in 3 dimensions. The first tissues form soft, porous structures capable of flexibility and strength at once. Tissues fold into shapes capable of channeling water, capturing food, shielding vulnerable interiors. The earliest bodies are crude sponges of living matter, anchored to rocks, filtering nutrients through their pores. But they represent a profound innovation. Life is learning to build architecture. Not the simple geometry of membranes, but the rich complexity of form. You drift through a forest of these early bodies, rooted to the seafloor. They sway slowly, drawing currents through their porous walls. Each one is a community of thousands of cells, each cell part of a greater whole that grows, repairs, and adapts as one organism. Above them, free-swimming forms glide through the water, simple but decisive in their movements, propelled by coordinated waves of cellular appendages. Life has learned locomotion, not drifting, not being carried, but moving with self-generated force. Some bodies twist their filaments in spirals, pushing themselves forward. Others flatten their tissues into soft paddles, beating rhythmically to glide upward or downward. Motion, once a consequence of external forces, has become a tool, and with motion comes new opportunity. Bodies that can move find richer currents, better nutrients, safer refuges. They explore environments beyond those available to anchored colonies. They encounter new gradients and challenges that drive further adaptation. Cells within these bodies begin to communicate more precisely. Chemical signals, once random, are now organized into patterns, responses to light, to flow, to pressure. Primitive nervous systems take shape, simple networks where a stimulus in one region triggers a reaction in another. It is not thought, but it is coordination, an early whisper of cognition forming in the darkness. The ocean feels different now. It no longer merely hosts life, it resonates with it. Every current carries the motion of bodies learning new strategies. Every shadow is shaped by structures that did not exist in earlier ages. The world is filling with forms, each one exploring possibilities, expanding the boundaries of what life can be. As you drift upward, you feel the convergence of countless innovations gathering into a single, inevitable direction. Bodies are not finished evolving. Their forms will grow more intricate, their coordination more refined, their interactions more profound. They will rise from the sea floor, swim through open water, and eventually reshape the surface of the planet itself. Life has learned to build itself into something larger than a cell, larger than a colony, larger than a cluster. It has learned to form bodies, and that is where your journey leads. Next, toward the threshold, where complexity meets intelligence, and the first senses awaken in the quiet waters of the ancient sea. The ocean has grown bright with life, not the light of stars, nor the glow of molten stone, but the soft radiance of motion of bodies, drifting and pulsing, sensing and responding, weaving themselves through the currents like thoughts passing through a sleeping mind. You glide through the warm layers where the earliest creatures roam. Their shapes are simple, still soft bodies, porous sponges, ribbon-like swimmers propelled by waves of coordinated cells, but each carries within it the trace of something new. A tension, a readiness, a question rising quietly from the ancient chemistry that birthed them. Something is changing. Inside these early bodies, networks of specialized cells connect in long, branching lines. They spread like delicate filaments, reaching from one region of tissue to another, carrying tiny pulses of chemical signals. These pulses travel faster than diffusion alone would allow. They coordinate reactions. They synchronize motion. They unify sensation across an entire organism. These are not nerves, not yet, but they are the prelude to sensation. You drift closer to a creature shaped like a soft, translucent disc. It hovers above the seafloor, pulsing gently to maintain its position in the water. At the edge of its body, a ring of specialized cells thickens, cells that respond not only to touch, but to faint changes in light. When a shadow passes overhead, the ring tightens, the body contracts. The creature drifts downward into darker, safer water. This is the first whisper of awareness. Not thought, not reflection, but response deliberate, coordinated, shaped by a nervous thread forming deep within its tissues. Nearby, thin, worm-like organisms glide through the currents, guided by sensors that detect chemical gradients. They follow trails of nourishment with precision, weaving through the darkness with a purpose shaped by their internal architectures. Their bodies bend, turn, curl. Each movement is a decision carved by reaction pathways that echo through their primitive neural webs. Life is learning to sense the world. The ocean becomes a map of information: light, pressure, current, temperature, chemical trace. Every signal becomes a thread, and every creature learns to weave those threads into action. As organisms grow more capable, they begin to interact in ways no previous generation ever did. Some follow the movement of others. Some hide in their shadows. Some feed on drifting colonies. Some hunt. Predation begins as a quiet extension of complexity, one organism reacting to another with speed, with coordination, with sharpened sensitivity. Survival becomes intertwined with perception, and perception becomes the seed of intelligence. You ascend slowly through these living layers, watching as bodies flicker past each one, carrying within it a pattern more intricate than the last. Some respond to touch, some to sound like vibrations carried through the water, some to subtle shifts in the electric fields around them. Every sense that emerges becomes a doorway to choice, a doorway to awareness, a doorway to future minds waiting in the long centuries ahead. Above, the sunlight filters through waves in trembling ribbons, illuminating the world with a clarity no creature has yet fully seen. But they feel it, they follow it, they shape their lives around it. The ocean has become a cradle for perception, each organism gathering fragments of the world and stitching them into the faintest beginnings of experience. You rise toward the boundary where water meets sky, the surface shimmering like a threshold between two realms. Beneath you, the ocean's new inhabitants continue their slow awakening, each generation adding a new thread to an unfolding tapestry of sensation. You know what will come next. Eyes, brains, memory. Creatures that think, that choose, that transform the surface as deeply as life once reshaped the sea. But that story belongs to another era. Here, at the edge of the ancient ocean, you pause, listening to the quiet world below, the soft hum of early awareness forming like a dawn beneath the waves. The planet has moved far from its molten youth, far from the sparks and shadows that shaped its earliest moments. Yet its motion continues, patient and unbroken. The first tremor that stirred the universe has echoed through stars, through worlds, through oceans, through cells, and now through minds. You breathe with the waves as they rise and fall, their rhythm older than memory, older than light, older than time, as life will one day measure it. And as the world settles into the silence of its ancient night, a final thought drifts through the dark, a thought carried not by words, but by the soft continuity of motion. Close your eyes now. The universe is still turning.